Seems like a good moment to take some questions.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask you all, point it more towards my mouth, yes, sorry. I'd like to ask you all, what surprised you and pleased you the most about how your own thinking has moved on in the recent past?
Thank you. And could we take the one behind as well?
Can I first start off with the negative? I find that a very sort of navel-gazing debate. When I came to this sort of, I really loved the idea of, do African conceptions of the self or Chinese Mohist logic offer equally valid insights? And I was sort of hoping for a discussion about more specifics because it says to interrogate the limits of Western philosophy. Do any of you have any? See what the question is? Do any of you have any experience of those? What is the limit of Western philosophy, and what does, for example, African Mohist thought have to, or Chinese Mohist logic, or the African conceptions of the self? What are those ideas, and how do they relate to Western philosophy, and how do they differ? Do you see what I mean? More specifics that would give me some clarity about what the limits of Western philosophy are.
Go for it.
This book is 15 years old, so I'm not plugging it anymore. But in a book called Eastern Philosophy, I actually tackle exactly the question of the nature of logic in Mohism, and Chinese and Indian philosophy. The problem is that it's quite demanding. I spent 3 years learning classical Chinese, and I've forgotten most of it because the languages I work in are Tamil, Sanskrit, Prakrit, Pali, but not classical Chinese. But therefore, that's why it's difficult for us to get down to into the weeds, because we're asking the larger questions. I think once you start asking it in terms of what the limits of a tradition are, you cannot give a global answer to it. You have to go to every tradition that you're dealing with, asking where is it running out. So some of the work I've been doing is, in terms of this historical comparison that we're talking about, is to say that modern philosophy as it is developed in the West reacted in a particular historical trajectory to Descartes and the idea that we are made up of body and mind, and how to overcome those divides. There are other traditions which, for good or for ill, never quite tackled it in that way. They might have made the analytic distinctions about body and mind and other kinds of aspects of the human being, but they read the human being in a different way. But in order to say, well, what does that show? I've been writing, 3 or 4 books, and I can't even pretend that I've begun to really understand how to say what the problem is. All I can do is to act it through. So I think it's a little unfair for you to expect us to be able to sort of say, let's get down into the weeds on this particular question, and then by the time we've even set the preliminaries, we are out of time.
But it might be a good moment to pitch your events later today.
I can only think of things I wrote 20 years ago.
Ram will be in the ring at 4 p.m. talking about ideas of consciousness in Indian philosophy. So I think that's a bit more the specificity that you were looking for. Perhaps we can come back to the other question we had about what surprised you in terms of the development of your own thinking.
What surprised me most over the last 3 years is how I was able to simplify the logic of conditionals, the if-then statements, in ways that depended on showing that certain kinds of complications were the result of taking judgments that are psychologically natural too much at face value, when in fact they're based on kind of heuristics, that kind of ways of thinking that people rely on that work most of the time but are not 100% reliable, and that to realize that there are errors in the data that had been blocking people from adopting a much more straightforward theories. I'm afraid I wasn't inspired by anything particular in. in a philosophical tradition, but actually more by influence from developments in psychology to do with the idea of heuristics that people rely on in their thinking.
Nivi?
Yeah, what surprised me and actually displeased me rather than pleased me was the fact that I can't take anything anymore for granted. So I need to problematize everything I see or read or hear, and that, I'm nowhere near the end of my thinking on this. So hopefully that would also change in a few years. But that's the one thing that has led to quite a lot of reflection. And but yes, it's not often pleasing, but it is surprising that I'm so very often wrong. And I don't even know whether I'm wrong or whether right or wrong exists. Even now I'm kind of problematizing what I'm saying. And so, I just want to come back to your point about how you expected something different. Like I said, I'm not. I haven't ever studied Chinese philosophy or African philosophy. I'm not a philosopher. But for me, what the limit of Western philosophy is the fact that it refuses to recognize its own limits. The fact that it continues to claim truth to everything it says, and the fact that it can be exoticized or provincialized when you're coming at it from a different angle doesn't occur to itself. Now again, I'm homogenizing, but it tends to do that itself. So that is, to me, the limit. And that's not a limit coming from any other tradition. It's coming from within the tradition, if you see what I'm saying. Yeah.
Well, what surprised me is that after spending 25 years speaking for myself as an Indian philosopher in conversation with the West, I've been struck by how younger people are making me think how much I must think against myself as somebody who comes from a very elite Indian tradition of thought, and as a man who assumes too many things. So it's learning to speak against myself that has most surprised me and has most necessarily surprised me.
Should we take some more questions?
Thank you. First of all, I wonder whether what we say, or the question said, was a prejudice, perhaps, against any other philosophy, unless it's European, American, or whatever. Whether that's partly based on ignorance of Eastern philosophy, for example, because perhaps they thought, Western philosophy is very secular. Eastern philosophy to them just looked like religion or spirituality and did not respect it enough. And the point you made about Western philosophy doesn't perhaps know its limits. I think the definition of consciousness, and I know you're going to talk about that at 4 p.m., but that's one area that seems to me I get a lot of arrogance about where we go with consciousness and what the definition may be. Anyway, I don't know whether that was a question or...
I think there's a question here.
Thank you. I was going to ask about where do the panelists think that the obsession for generalizability comes from, and how useful is it?
Thank you. And I think there's one question. If you could pass it back, that'd be great.
Thank you. I was interested, you were talking about rationalism and mysticism being the sort of Indian stereotyping practice in universities. And I've studied both Western philosophy in BHU in India, in an Indian university, and Indian philosophy in a Western university. And I feel like both is, you then try to rationalize what is a more mystical way of thinking about the world, and also vice versa. And then you miss quite a lot of the points and the values. And I just wondered if you think there's a fundamental incompatibility between, for example, conceptions of what is the truth. So in India, truth is something eternal, unchanging. Means Brahman, means truth is that. And then maybe in a Western tradition, truth is exactly this ability to constantly update it and change it empirically. And I wondered if that or something else you thought was incompatible.
I need to really come back on that. There is no such distinction. It would come as a shock to Augustine or Aquinas to be told that they weren't committed to an eternal truth. And it would come as a shock to the Kerala school of astronomy in the 12th and 13th century, who were developing a heliocentric theory of the world, that they weren't constantly expanding the horizons of their investigation. There are no such generalizabilities. The first thing about really having to come to grips with different traditions of thought is never to be contented with a level of generalizability. There is always internal contestation. Some questions are asked in certain traditions that are not asked in other traditions. That's perfectly true. But it's actually shocking how many questions are asked by all kinds of different traditions. And I think it's realizing how decentered is any one tradition of thought that we haven't yet grappled with. It's a real, genuine shock when you read a text which has clearly no historical connection with some other text in some other part of the world, in some other language you're used to, and you confront this question, and that keeps people like comparative philosophers like me employed. But that is actually really important, to not think that there are simple contrasts.
We come back to this question on the obsession for generalizability. Tim?
Well, I mean, one advantage of generalizations is that they're extremely informative, if they're true. And so if you can get them, they're a good thing. I do think that one thing that has happened is in philosophy recently, but much earlier in the natural sciences, is that people have learned that there are certain areas where you can't really expect exceptionless generalizations. I mean, maybe you can't actually expect even very many of those, even in biology. And what you have to look for are simple models that, as it were, abstract away from a lot of the mess of the real world, but still give you an insight into some of the structures that are in some messy form are operating. And so that's a different kind of understanding, which I think is becoming more accepted within analytic philosophy. I mean, but one thing I wanted to say in answer to the questions was that when we're talking about the limits of the Western tradition, there's a difference between the limits of where it's got at any particular time and the limits of it as an ongoing tradition that persists over long periods. Because I think you'd be hard put to find any analytic philosopher who thought that analytic philosophy had somehow got exclusive rights to the truth. That would be a crazy claim. And I mean, I think almost everyone would agree that there are, as it were, good ideas that we've not yet had and that are better than what we're thinking at the moment. I think it'd be crazy to not to think that. And I think the real question is whether a tradition is open enough that it can accept improvements on its ideas which are coming from the outside. And I think it's not clear that the analytic tradition can't do that, because I think that the stereotype that it's only within the Western tradition that valuable philosophy happened has been pretty much abandoned by most analytic philosophers. I think the ones who would stick to that are pretty old-fashioned and marginalized.
Well, on the question of whether there's been good ideas that we haven't yet had, they absolutely do make space for that. But what about the ideas that we might have had the monopoly to philosophize not rested within 0.01% of the world's population and 1% at that time, right? So that is why Western philosophy needs to be exoticized and provincialized, not because it hasn't had good ideas and not because it doesn't say that good ideas might yet be had, but the fact that it doesn't consider where it has come from and what that means for lots of people around the world.
Yeah, but I mean, that is to some extent crying over spilt milk. And the question is how we're going to get better ideas in the future. We can't do much about failings in the past, but we can think about how to do better in the future.
Well, we can also acknowledge more emphatically that we have had those failings rather than continuing to say we can only do better in the future. I don't think that's how progress is made. We need to say, okay, we've been pretty crap at a lot of this, and so what can we do and where else can we look? And there are archives there to still explore. Yeah.
Unfortunately, we are out of time. Thank you so much for coming. I think that's everything. Thank you so much. Do join me in thanking our speakers.
For more debates, talks and interviews, subscribe today to the Institute of Art and Ideas at IAI TV.